Today is February 5th, 2014. My name is Teresa Larson. I am chatting with Jerry Nelson, who is president of Nelson Electric. Thanks for joining me today, Jerry.
And thanks, Teresa, for having me.
Nelson Electric is now in its fourth generation of ownership and operation in Ames. And just to get things started, I have a real difficult question. What is your date of birth and where were you born?
I was born June 9th, 1945, here in Ames. And the main hospital is torn down now, but I was here in Ames.
Let's go back to some previous generations. So we'll start way back in about 1900, 1903, when your grandfather came to Ames. Tell me a little bit about that. Tell me his name and kind of what brought him to Ames.
He came to Ames. He was from a large family from Champaign, Illinois area. He was the oldest, so in order to make room for the youngest, sometimes the oldest ones leave the house. So that's what he did. He was about 20 years old. We think he hopped a train and somehow found Ames, Iowa going through. And that was in about 1903. He made some acquaintances here in town, evidently, and particularly a John Haverly, who worked at the electric light plant here in Ames, and he found a job. He gave him a job working in the light plant, and electricity was a new thing at the time, so he started to work at the light plant.
Now let me ask a question about electricity. Your grandfather's name was Benjamin?
Oh, Charles Benjamin Nelson.
Charles Benjamin Nelson.
Yeah, and everybody knew his Ben. So.
And electricity at that time, it would be hard for someone in this century to appreciate the fact that it was so novel. But what was electricity used for, and where was it in town in 1903?
The light plant was built somewhere around 1900, so it was relatively new. Their first projects was to wire lighting down through Main Street to electrify the gas lights, and then they moved into the commercial businesses. And you just learned by doing in those days. There was no apprenticeship programs. It was relatively new. They didn't know how safe it really was. And so he just started out just by learning the trade, just by doing, electrifying Ames. It was the municipal utility at the time didn't allow for private contracting. It wasn't that big anyway, so it wasn't open to private contractors till 1908. They discovered in 1908 that electricity was safe to be in homes and in businesses. And I think they finally realized that it was just more than the city could handle on a municipal basis. So they opened it up to private contracting, and that's when my grandfather went into business for himself as a private contractor, and he formed Nelson Electric Company in 1908.
And what was their first address on Main Street?
Their first address, he opened up a small shop at 304 Main Street. He had a small presence there. He had a little showroom, and we've got pictures of his showroom. And he was there for 3 years, and then he moved to a new location down on 320 Main Street, where the Main Street Brewing Company is at right now, in the west part of that. And that building was just being built. So one of his advertisements said that he would be moving there as soon as the building was completed. So, and it must have been a little bit late because he apologized in the advertisement that he wasn't there yet. So,
let's talk a little bit about what kind of work procedures there were. So this is kind of a crossover generation. You have someone who's applying electricity to businesses and homes, but yet he wasn't in motor cars, probably using human power and horsepower.
Yeah, he had a little push cart that they put all these materials in, and he had a little push cart that they pushed to wherever they were working. And that's how they got around. We did do some projects in Story City. He did do a number of projects in Story City around 1914, 1915, somewhere in that area. He did do the theater up there, the movie theater up there. And I know that I've heard him, my father talk about him loading his push cart in the train every day and riding the train to Story City, doing the work, and then coming home at night on the train with his push cart. And that's how they got around in those days.
I believe there's actually I don't know if it's an invoice or a proposal for a project in Story City. I think it's a residence on Cottage. Tell me a little bit about that project.
We have the original estimate, and it was a handwritten estimate to install light fixtures and switches. There weren't many appliances at the time, but there might have been an outlet or two that they would put in also. But he wired the whole house for $54 and some cents. I can't remember exactly what it is. Like $54.84, I think is what it was. So, and that was to wire an entire home.
Do you have any idea how long that might have taken him?
You know, I don't know. I can't remember if the hours were on that invoice. We'd have to look at the invoice, and I do have a copy of it, and we could look at the invoice. It might have a detailed hours that he would have in that.
I was just trying to get a feeling for what income might have been like. What it must have been like to do that.
Yeah. You know, I don't have any idea. It's just probably, I'm sure it's pretty meager in today's standards, I'm sure.
So we're starting here in about 1908 when your grandfather started his company up to, say, the year 1920. So summarize for me what you think the pluses and minuses of being in the electrical business were at that time. First of all, one of the pluses, he was new on the block.
He was, and he was a new entrepreneur into a new industry. So it was probably pretty exciting at the time. It's probably just like today. The technology keeps changing, and probably more so in his time, the rate of change, going from gas lights to lighting to appliances. Appliances were probably a big seller in the teens and the 20s as they became toasters and irons, mixers. You know, and he sold those in his showroom at his business. We have pictures of that also.
So you mentioned toasters. That was probably a novel thing, and I did see a Christmas display ad that was in the newspaper. Tell me a little bit about that.
They have live displays on the weekends. I think it was on Saturday mornings. Some of our relatives would, there were two small girls that would go down, and they would demonstrate making toast on these new toasters. And I assume they'd give the toast away, but they would demonstrate that so people would come in and buy toasters and appliances.
And perhaps irons might have been something, one of the first appliances sold there?
Probably irons, toasters, mixers, little handheld mixers. I remember seeing some pictures of those in there. Just a number of appliances were just becoming on for the consumer.
Did your father ever talk about some of those days when it evolved from just lighting houses to starting to be a more complex business in the 20s and 30s?
I would think that by the 20s and 30s there were more appliances, more uses in the house, vacuum cleaners. You'd need different outlets around the house, and so I would assume there'd be more, just more in quantity in wiring a house, probably more than anything. And same way with your business. I'm sure downtown businesses were the same way.
So there might have even been some call to rewire things. Things might be initially electrified in your grandfather's initial start, and then pretty soon this demand for electricity, you'd have to come back and rewire. Nelson Electric was coming back.
Yeah, you'd be upgrading all the time. I would guess just by the materials that you could see the progression of the technology of the materials, electrical panels. A small electrical service might be 2 fuses in the beginning with just a little open pull-out with live parts on it, which couldn't, I mean, OSHA would, they'd throw the book at you using those methods of wiring today as they did then. So it went from probably 2 fuses to 4 fuse panels with pull-outs that maybe had electric range on it now. And then you see the progression of electric clothes dryers. Well, then it goes to bigger panels, more fuses, and then in the 60s, everything converted from fuses over to circuit breakers. So you could just plug in whatever appliance you wanted to connect up, you just plugged it in. So as appliances became more readily available to the consumer, it also correlates to larger electric services and where we're at today.
Your grandfather, starting the company in 1908, had a good sense of marketing and promotion, because you've shown me some advertisements that were in the Ames paper of different things. So it also shows the progression of the telephone growth in Ames, different exchanges, for example, and different connotations and different. There were, I think, 2 private companies at first, and that sort of thing. So tell me a little bit about your grandfather's advertising and some of the advertising that you've seen for Nelson Electric.
We have found just numerous pieces that he has done. Mainly, for example, like the Iowa State Student Directory, he would be there. We found a number of years he advertised in that. There's some advertising in the Ames Tribune, and back in the mid-teens, we've actually found advertising where he did in programs for the movie theaters in town. They actually had programs for the week that would show the different shows every night of the week. So they would give you programs. Well, we found an advertisement in there that he advertised. So he did do some advertising, some marketing to some degree. You know, you can probably marketing. You know, back in those days, probably more word of mouth than anything. But yeah, we've actually had 5 different phone numbers and through the period of time. So.
And I believe that your grandfather helped wire one of the first movie theaters downtown as well.
In 1938, we wired Joe Brock's new state-of-the-art movie theater, complete with air conditioning, and it had high fidelity sound system. And there's a piece in the newspaper showing my dad on top of a ladder wiring a speaker into this new state-of-the-art sound system, and that was probably the first theater that I know we did, other than the one we did in Story City back in 1915.
Let's talk about now the 1930s. You mentioned 1930s. It was tough for a lot of people everywhere. How was it for your grandfather and your father in the 1930s?
Yeah, it was in the Depression, and they were on Main Street at the time. And it was about 1933, 1934. I remember my dad saying that there were times that the cash register just didn't even open for days. And it was very, very tough. It came to the place where he couldn't afford the rent, so they moved to 816 Clark. They moved off Main Street to his house, and there was a 3-car garage behind the house, and then he rented a 3-car garage across the alley, and we operated there from 34 to about 1964, 65. So we were there for 30 years. And it was kind of a residential setting. It was between Clark and Burnett in the alley, between 8th and 9th. And we operated out of there for a number of years. And we had a little showroom there, and it was it served its purpose, and the rent was much more manageable at the time.
In the 1930s, there just probably wasn't a lot of money for construction, and that's probably what happened then.
Yeah, and everything in construction is kind of cyclical, as everybody in the industry knows. And we went through one of those periods. It wasn't quite as drastic, but in the early '80s, there was a period of time in the '80s that there was about 3 years there that just was pretty tough.
Kind of lean.
It was very lean.
So let's go ahead and move to the 1940s. The war started. Granted, there were still things to be built and still things to be wired, but your father had an important job in the war effort.
He did. And I think he taught at Iowa State, and I think it was a way to supplement their income because it was probably not as there wasn't a lot happening during the war times, I would guess. So he taught at Iowa State University, teaching in the Navy, teaching how to wire airport landing strips, portable ones. So people could go in, they'd make a landing strip. He'd tell these folks how to wire it. And then also he did some marine, how to wire ships also. He did some marine electrical work, teaching folks how to wire then the marine ships, naval ships, because it was for the Department of Navy that he did work there. And he worked there probably for, I'm guessing, probably 4 or 5 years. He did that through the war. And then after the war, then it became a construction boom again.
During the 1940s, because of the war effort, certain kinds of materials were either hard to get or they were allocated. And being in the construction industry, I mean, a lot of those materials were needed for the war effort. I believe you've come across some evidence that the Nelson Electric Company had to make sure that they were careful about using steel and wire and such.
Yeah, I'm sure that the steel and copper was in short supply, or what was there, they would want to know where it was consumed by. And you had to register it. One of our invoices, we sold some material to a construction company, and we had to actually register it, that we sold that, so they know the transaction took place. Now, I'm not sure exactly the intricacies of that, but I know that you did have to register that sale with the government, so they knew where those raw materials were going.
Because, of course, the government wanted to have as much raw material go for the war effort. So the building boom of the 1950s. Tell me a little bit about what your grandfather and your father said about service people coming home and what happened to the electrical industry during that time period.
Can't remember much about the 50s. That's I was very young at the time, and but I do know that there was a lot of activity, construction wise, in the community. There's churches being built, more commercial, and a lot of homes were being built. And we had, I think at the time we probably had maybe 6 or 7 employees at the time. We have a nice picture of our 4 trucks lined up in the alleyways out in front of the, or actually is in the back of our 3-car garage there. So that was pretty exciting to have 4 trucks and 6 employees.
Speaking of trucks, I don't mean this to be an advertisement for one brand over another, but your grandfather, C.B. Nelson, known as Ben Nelson, apparently really liked Dodge trucks.
He did. He liked Dodge cars, anything Dodge he liked. So he had he bought a new Dodge car every couple of years, and he loved them. I remember in 1957 he brought a brand new black and white one, had the fins on it and everything, and that was it.
But the company eventually evolved to other brands.
We did. In the early '60s, vans started appearing. 61, 62, Ford made a little Econoline van. So we kind of standardized on Econoline vans, the Ford ones, and we had those through a number of years till they stopped making them in the 70s. And then when we started buying the Ford full-size vans, and now we just drive Ford pickups and vans. So it goes back 50 years of our Ford trucks.
In the 1960s also, I think, was when your iconic emblem for Nelson Electric, one of them got started, the Sparky?
Yeah, we had a little emblem of Sparky, and we sewed, it was a cloth material. We sewed it on the backs of all of our shirts, and we used that probably for 10 years, and then it finally just kind of evolved and just kind of fell by the wayside. The trend kind of drifted another direction. So we abandoned Sparky, but we actually have some vintage T-shirts that we have in the company, and we have a number of T-shirts the guys wear, and we have the vintage one, and it's surprising how well our guys love those T-shirts. They still wear them. They want to wear the old ones with Sparky on them.
Very few companies make it to 3 generations with the same family ownership, let alone 4 generations, because your son Chris now is involved, and your other son is also coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about how you think that happened.
You know, in looking back on it, they both they both graduated from college.
Your sons?
Both sons. I have 3 sons. They both, all of them graduated from college. They went away from Ames, finding other jobs, and I never really did, pressure them to feel like they had to come back to the business. I always felt that to coming back to the business, they would have to want to come. I wasn't going to put any pressure on them, but Chris actually spent 10 years away from the business. He worked in Chicago for a while, for several years, and then in Des Moines for 8 years for a very large construction company. And Matt moved to Minneapolis, and he found a girl that lived in Minneapolis, so he decided to move to Minneapolis. And but I think in the end, they recognized the roots of Ames, and it's always stuck in them. And I think they just wanted to come back to Ames and wanted to come back to the business. So we worked with them and was able to have them come back, and we're very glad that they are.
Let's look at the 3 previous generations. Your grandfather, Ben, your father, Chuck, and you and your brother. What made it successful? How did that long run?
Well, that's a tough question, Teresa. I don't know. I came back from the business. I was in graduate school at the time, and I was working summers as I normally did. And I just decided during the summertime that maybe this is kind of what I wanted to do. So I just kind of defaulted into it, really. And I'm sure my brother did about the same thing. Because we'd work holidays, summers, anytime, weekends. The work week back when we started, or when I started back in the 50s, was actually a 48-hour week. And we worked Saturdays. That was a 48-hour week. And then in the 60s, we went to half days on Saturdays for a number of years, maybe 10 years, somewhere in there. And then we finally figured out that half day wasn't that productive, so we just went to a 40-hour work week. And I think that was pretty consistent with the industry. So back in the early 60s and 70s, the money looked good, so I just kind of by defaulted back here.
And why do you think your father stayed in the business? Why, with his...
I don't know. He graduated from high school in, it was 1926 or 27. And I think he just, I don't know why. I never asked him the question. But I think the industry at that time was probably pretty attractive. it was new, relatively new yet. It's still pretty challenging, and so I think he probably thought it was pretty exciting to probably be in the electrical field.
Well, let's talk about some memorable jobs or memorable projects or things that might be a touchstone for other people. I know Nelson Electric was involved with a movie that was shot here in central Iowa.
Mm-hmm. We did. That was probably one of our most unusual jobs that we did. Twister came to town. They filmed Twister in central Iowa. We went down down at the old Ramada Inn. They set up their trailers in the back parking lot, and they wanted a price to wire in those trailers, and we gave them a price to do that, and we wired them up. And then next thing, they wanted to know if we would be on call 24/7 for them for all their production out in the field. They did a house in Eldora, which we fixed up, and then they did the weather center was actually in the pier. We did their little weather center for them, and I think in Hubbard they built the combine and some of their implements up there. So we wired their workshop up there, and just a number of places around. They would shoot during the day for the most part, and at night that is when they would do all the fixing and everything. So that's when we would do that. So it was a very different project from what you normally would see. So it was pretty exciting.
I'm sure in some ways it was, well, kind of tough because you would set it up and then you know it's either going to be blown up or torn up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like the house in Eldora. They fixed this old farmhouse up. It was abandoned. Birds were flying in and out of it. It was pretty tough shape. But they fixed it, the two sides of it up, and it looked like $1 million house. It was just gorgeous. But you walk around the backside, it was trashed. But then when they got done with the Twister, they actually set a kind of a jet engine up underneath the windmill that blew all the debris to the house. And when they got done, the backside looked just like the front.
And when you say we did the house, that probably means you wired it, you put electricity inside so that somebody would flip a switch and look like it was occupied.
Yeah, there wasn't much electric in it. They just wanted to put lights in it to make it look like somebody was home. And I think in the end, the house scene was only like 20 seconds long, maybe 30 seconds. It was amazing the work that went into it for 30 seconds. It was just amazing.
I might have missed how you got this job. How did you even connect with Warner Brothers to begin with?
I think they just called when they came to town. They probably looked in the phone book and said, "Yeah, here we are."
But you had competition during that time period.
We did. They bid it out. We bid it, and we were low bidder on it.
Okay.
So, and then things just kind of evolved from there. We developed a relationship with them, and it was good, and we moved on from there.
Also, Nelson Electric was responsible, I think, for helping out with the July 4th carnival that used to come to town year after year after year. Tell me about that.
I remember wiring those. In fact, I did that when I worked out in the field out on East 13th Street.
Can you give me a rough time period?
I would say 60s, 70s.
Okay.
They with 4th of July, the JCs would really take that project on, and we would wire all the carnival rides and all the vendors, and we would spend probably a week just wiring everything up. And then they'd have the 4th of July carnival, and they'd have the fireworks down in the South River Valley Park area, and that was pretty exciting. 4th of July. Then the next Monday you tore everything down. So
that was good practice for getting that movie job.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was.
Do you recall your father or grandfather talking about when there started to be wiring diagrams for homes or businesses and how that evolved?
We have plans in our archives that shows the blueprints. They call them blueprints, and they were actually blue with white lines on them. It was just the type of technology they had at the time for their drawings. They were probably they were pretty elementary. It was a lot of discretion in the field to do a lot of things. So, not as they are today. Today they're very specific, everything is laid out, and they're very specific. So as technology changes and our field becomes more complex, the drawings do the same. They become more complex, more thorough.
In this Story County area, are there buildings that Nelson Electric has been involved with that you're particularly proud of that work, or they're big buildings, or it was exceedingly complex? Some jobs you'd like to talk about?
I think we're proud of everything we do, really, large or small. Some of the small projects are very rewarding, along with the larger projects. Yeah, I think probably the most complex one that I can remember is we put a new electrical service in the Memorial Union, and in 1984, their electrical system was pretty much original. A lot of the circuits inside of it that goes up to the major electrical panels, there was very old wiring. It all needed to be replaced, and the building never closes. So it's like giving a heart transplant to to a living patient. It never closes. There's 15,000 people that walk through that building a day. So it was a very methodical thing that you had to do to try to keep all the power outages at a very minimum, and you had to do one little thing at a time. And finally, you put in the new electrical service, and you just transferred everything over to the new electrical service, one little piece at a time. It took 2 years to do it, and there was just a lot of coordination issues, and that was probably a pretty complex project. Looking back on it, scheduling the work, how to do it, and keep the power outages at the very minimum you possibly can, because that building is just used constantly. And there's about 500,000 square feet in this building, so it is not a small building, and it was pretty challenging, actually.
I know that Nelson Electric adopted new technology as soon as it was available, and when fluorescent lights came in, I think you did some jobs for businesses, and you might even have a picture of one downtown, a men's clothing store.
We did. Jameson's clothing store. I don't know, kind of, the time period was probably late 30s or in the 40s, somewhere in that time frame. Fluorescent lighting just became the new technology, and we did the luminous ceiling, what they call luminous ceiling. Had just stripped fluorescent light fixtures, and then they had this grid work below it, so you couldn't actually see the fluorescent lights, but there was enough space in the louvers that the light came down through it. So the ceiling was lit entirely, and it was at the time that was pretty good.
I bet it was pretty snazzy looking.
It was pretty snazzy looking. We have pictures of that. So it was quite the deal at the time.
I always like to pause at this point in our conversation and say, is there anything that you would like to pick up the thread of? And we've been talking about the different addresses. We've not gotten to the current one yet. Pick up the thread of either at 304 Main or 320 Main or 816 Clark. Anything that you'd like to pick the thread up of that I might have forgotten to ask you.
Maybe just do a timeline, maybe
Sure.
a little bit. We were at like the 304 Main for 4 years, and then from 1912 to 1934 approximately, we were on Main Street, and then on 1934 to 1964 we moved to 816 Clark, and from 65 we moved to 116 Clark to 1995. So we were there for about 30 years, and then from there we moved in 1996 we moved to 239 South Bell Avenue. So we've been 30-year increments almost.
I hadn't asked you about 116 Clark, and I've forgotten to do that. That was kind of south of the track, so to speak, and at the time period, Clark didn't go through. How did that affect your business?
Clark did not go through, and it was amazing. It was kind of on the other side of the tracks. The road was a dirt road out in front. The alleyway was dirt. There was a lumberyard across the street from us. The ready mix plant was kind of catty corner from us. The concrete plant was there. So I think Martin had his chrome plating place in this building. The Cole Construction Company was there before him, and it was back in the 30s. So we occupied this building. We renovated it, and then had a little storage building out behind. And we just plain outgrew it. We just didn't need to be in downtown Ames. The tracks in 1970, Clark came through. They got rid of the railroad switching yards in downtown Ames, and they put the parking lot in. So it really started developing a little bit more downtown, and we certainly outgrew the space, and it could be utilized for something better than what we were using the land for. So the land out in the new industrial park became available, and it made sense for us to find a new building and actually have a little bit of room to grow.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about?
Wow. Nothing really comes to mind particularly. I think, well, there's one more thing. I think when my grandfather started out, there were no electrical codes. And as it became more complex, they started developing codes. Back when I started learning the code, there was a written code. I'm not sure exactly when they started coming in, probably the 20s or the 30s. The code books were probably about this thick and about this big. They weren't very big. Now they're about this thick and they're this big. And we're experiencing probably 3,000 changes in our code cycle, which is every 3 years. We get 3,000 changes every 3 years. And the technology and the industry is just constantly evolving.
It's staggering to think about, just from your grandfather's time, just stringing wires on poles, to now the kind of equipment that we have that needs to be driven with electricity, and the variety of equipment and the hunger we have for that energy is.
Oh, yeah. I learned by climbing poles. You strap the climbers and the cleats to your legs. You have the belt with the strap over it. You wrap the strap around the pole, and you just kind of shinny up the pole. That's how I learned. There were no ladder trucks, and that kind of dates me a little bit. But back in the early 60s, or the 50s, 40s and 50s, there were no ladder trucks when I started learning. And then in the about in the mid-60s, the ladder trucks started coming in on the contractor level, where they came down in price where the contractors could afford them. And really on the utility side, that's probably when they started too. So as the technology changes with ladder trucks, then everybody started buying them. And now you talk to our new guys, and they don't even know what you're talking about when you talk about cleats and a shinny belt. They don't know, which is good.
I really want to thank you for spending time with me talking about Nelson Electric's 4 generations of serving the Ames community. Thank you very much, Jerry.
Well, thank you, Teresa, for having me in today.